各位
Members, we have now a quorum. Can I invite the administration into the room, please? Administration.
各位今日咧就
Members, this is the meeting of the subcommittee on the long-term housing strategy under the panel on housing. This is our last meeting, and I'm grateful to you for your support. There is only one item on the agenda: revitalization of industrial buildings. Yes, please take your seat. Paper number CB bracket 11529/12 to 13 bracket 01. Administration's paper on revitalization of industrial buildings. If I may welcome to the meeting Mr. Thomas Chen, Deputy Secretary for Development, Planning and Lands, Mr. Jeff Lam, Deputy Director, Lands Department, Mr. Yu Tak Chang, Assistant Director of Buildings, and Ms. Teresa Yim, Assistant Director, Housing Department. Welcome, all of you, to the meeting. Who's going to take us through the paper, please, Mr. Chen? Will it be you? The subcommittee would like the Development Bureau to brief you on the revitalization of industrial buildings, in particular on measures to encourage the redevelopment of old industrial buildings or wholesale conversion. So you've asked for a briefing. And today, we would like to brief you on suggestion made previously. That is wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. We would like to brief you on the latest progress. Now, for vacant or underutilized industrial buildings, it's hoped that through redevelopment or conversion, more floor space could be provided for non-industrial use. That's to keep in line with the economic and social development needs of Hong Kong. So that's why in 2009 we have announced a set of revitalization measures, and they came into effect on the 1st of April 2010. And these measures include encouraging redevelopment of industrial buildings. For the application threshold for compulsory sale orders for industrial buildings aged 30 years or above, situated in non-industrial zones, the threshold is lowered from 90% to 80%. And also, we allow tailor-made lease modifications at pay-for-what-you-build premium. That is, we assess premium based on the optimal use and proposed development intensity of the redevelopment. We also allow owners to opt for payment of land premium by annual installments up to a period of 5 years. We also encourage wholesale conversion of industrial buildings, because for some industrial buildings, maybe already, in terms of planned use, some use has been changed to non-industrial use without permission, but then the building may still be rather new. It's not due for redevelopment. In that case, we encourage wholesale conversion of these industrial buildings in the hope of optimizing the use of the floor space in these buildings. So we allow owners to apply for a waiver, and they don't need to pay any fee. And then they could change the use of existing industrial buildings for the lifetime of the building or the current lease period. And this measure is applicable to industrial buildings aged 15 years or above and situated in industrial, commercial, or other specified uses business zones. In 2011, we launched the measures, and we conducted a review in this, subsequently, and then we have introduced a number of refinements. First is about the technical aspects of a conversion. That is, for wholesale conversion, we have refined the measures for counting gross floor area an exemption of closed floor area in some cases. And we have also, through these measures, we've introduced more flexibility for wholesale conversion. We've also extended the deadline of submission of applications by 3 years, from the 31st of March 2013 to the 31st of March 2016. Up to the end of June this year, the Lands Department has approved a total of 71 applications under the revitalization measures, and that covers both cases of redevelopment and wholesale conversion. For the redeveloped or converted industrial buildings, when all these works are completed, we should be able to provide a total of gross floor area of about 720,000 square meters for various uses. And then the Chief Executive announced in his policy address this year that we would further examine possible refinements to the existing revitalization measures and facilitate revitalization for non-industrial users. And we're still conducting the study. We're still going in the direction of the last round of midterm review on the revitalization measures. We have regard to the redevelopment or wholesale conversion of industrial buildings. We are looking at possibilities of relaxing the requirements further so that we can encourage more owners to go for wholesale conversion. And then at the same time last year, the government announced that we would look into the feasibility of the option of allowing wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. That is, given within the existing structure, we try to see whether we could allow industrial building owners to apply to carry out modification works, so they could convert their industrial buildings into small-sized residential units for letting on an interim basis. Now we have studied the feasibility of this option. We consider it from the point of view of the existing regulatory regimes, first under the Buildings Department, second under the Planning Ordinance, and third under the conditions of land leases. For buildings for domestic use, there are certain planning requirements in relation to natural lighting and ventilation. Such provisions are for the safety and health of occupants. So if there's an application for an industrial building to be converted into domestic use, we have to consider whether the conversion could meet the natural lighting and ventilation requirements and so on under the existing ordinances. We note that for industrial buildings of a certain age, usually the design is such that it cannot meet the natural lighting and ventilation requirements under the buildings ordinance. For these buildings to meet the requirements, there will be substantial conversion involved, or they may even have to demolish part of the facade of the building. And we have gauged views of owners of industrial buildings. Now, such works may be technically feasible, that is, if they demolish part of the building so that they could meet the natural lighting and ventilation requirements. But then the works would be very costly. So that may undermine the feasibility of the option of converting industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. And also, buildings are always built to the making full occupying the entire site, and there is no setback as such. In that case, the requirements on windows under the buildings ordinance may not be met. So if no windows could be retrofitted in industrial buildings, then these buildings could not be used for domestic purpose either. For existing industrial buildings, the wholesale conversion to domestic use may not be so feasible given these constraints. And then from the town planning point of view, for the industrial buildings we mentioned, our usual practice is that we will consider the entire industrial building areas. We'll look at the planning aspects and the surrounding environment, and then it will only convert to use if the whole area is suitable. Now, we have seen changes of uses of industrial buildings to business use and so on. It's because we have changed the planning in these areas from industrial use to business or commercial use. That's why such changes of uses have been made possible. Now, for some industrial areas where they're suitable for changing into residential use, we have done it in the past. But when we do so, we always have to bear in mind a factor. Now, for the existing industrial buildings, they may be right next to industrial buildings which are still in operation. So we have to consider whether it's suitable for turning these industrial buildings into residential buildings, because these buildings would be right next door to other industrial buildings still in operation. So we have to consider the compatibility and the safety issues. So in this case, usually we would rezone such an area to residential E. The feature of residential E zones is that if an owner wants to apply to change the land use to residential, then the owner of the building must apply to the town planning board, and the owner must explain to the town planning board how his redevelopment proposal could address the question of incompatibility, because the building might be next to an operational industrial building. So in terms of planning, our primary consideration is this. Now let's say there is an old industrial building in a particular area. If in terms of the environment, the building is suitable for conversion to residential use, then we believe it's better to change the land use to residential, so that there could be the old industrial building could then be properly redeveloped into a residential building. But if say the area is not a residential area and the old industrial building is situated here, usually when we change the land use from industrial to commercial or business, it's because the building is not suitable for turning into residential use. So it's not ideal in terms of planning to allow wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. And then in terms of land lease, wholesale conversion of an industrial building for transitional accommodation use could be effected through application for special waiver. Technically, the arrangement is the same as that for application for hotel use, but still the preconditions are that the buildings ordinance's requirements and the town planning requirements are satisfied. And as we pointed out, both in terms of buildings and town planning requirements, if an existing industrial building is in an industrial area, it may not be desirable to turn it into transitional accommodation use in terms of the buildings and the town planning consideration. So having considered all these factors, we believe the proposal may not be feasible. And now we're currently conducting a new round of area assessments for industrial land in the territory. We'll be doing this new round this year. And referring to the experience from the past few rounds of the area assessments, for this particular round of area assessments, we'll focus on existing industrial areas where they could be rezoned into other uses, including residential uses. So in that case, we'll identify such industrial sites and then rezone them into residential sites. In the last round of area assessment, a total of 60 hectares of land was proposed for rezoning from industrial to other uses. Half of that is 30 hectares of land, was rezoned into residential uses. And also, we include a projection of industrial land demand in Hong Kong in the medium to long term in the area assessment, and we expect the assessment to be completed by 2014. So perhaps I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Christopher Chung, Raymond Wong, Tony Che, Luai Kwok, Leung Chi Chang, Alice Mack, and Paul Che. Each has 5 minutes, including the question and answer. Christopher Chung, please. Thank you, Chairman. I think the housing issue has to be resolved as soon as possible. When we talk about the redevelopment of industrial buildings, I have two suggestions. And first is the redevelopment of industrial buildings. If you lower the application threshold to 80% for compulsory sales orders, can you yet lower this threshold a little bit? I think this you're helping the property developers. However, if you don't provide incentives, nobody will take heed. For example, can you give more concessions on the land premiums? If you talk about residential uses, residential units, you will face all sorts of problems. But for industrial buildings, we do not have such problems. If you relax the regulations, it would not affect the residents. And the second point for transitional accommodation, when we talk about transitional accommodation, we should not have too many requirements. You have outlined a lot of technical requirements needed. I think this is not necessary. You should relax such regulations and requirements. If you think about industrial buildings, they are very spacious. They have wide passageways. From a safety or fire ordinance perspective, I think they are acceptable. They are certainly more sturdy than subdivided units. I think we should encourage the redevelopment of these units to solve our housing needs. I think this is a very imminent problem for Hong Kong residents. Thank you, Chairman, and Mr. Chung's question. On the application threshold of 80% for compulsory sales orders, when we introduced the revitalization measures in 2009, the application threshold was lowered from 90% to 80%. This is already a relaxing measure. It might not be as impactful as residential units. However, it still affects a lot of tenants. In our midterm review last time, we have addressed this problem. We do not see the lowering of the application threshold as a barrier to the revitalization of industrial buildings. On the issue of transitional accommodation, if we are to implement transitional accommodation, they must meet specific safety requirements, and the building environment must be suitable for residents in terms of health and safety. If we, when we talk about wholesale conversion, we will avoid the problem of having different uses for different flats, different floors. However, some buildings might still be located adjacent to other industrial buildings, and that's why we must have specific requirements for natural lighting and ventilation, etc. And as a result, modification works might not be financially viable for the owners. And on the other hand, redeveloping existing buildings into residential buildings might be a better solution. Chairman, I think it's more efficient to redevelop these existing buildings into residential flats rather than build new ones. Mr. Raymond Wong. Thank you, Chairman. We have a 4-page paper today from the Development Bureau. And the purpose of this meeting today is to find more space for housing. Today we have different departments here today. And this paper has to do with you too. And what you're doing is driving away people living in residential, in subdivided units in Tai Kok Tsui and other areas. And the first part of this paper basically talks about the revitalization measures of the industrial buildings. And you have an analysis on whether the transitional accommodation is viable, and the conclusion is it's not possible. Just now, Christopher Chung does not agree with this conclusion. And I agree with the analysis in paragraph 6 to 10. From the building control perspective, modification works are very costly, and it will impact the health and safety of residents. And the second reason in paragraph 8, from the town planning perspective, you have to take into account a lot of different factors, and that industrial buildings are not often suitable for residential use. I agree with this analysis. A lot of the times, in terms of decision making, the administration officials are not capable. They are just they only know how to talk back, and it's very bureaucratic, and they are only chasing after the figures in terms of housing issues, and they are not using their expertise. So I agree with your conclusion today. I agree with rezoning industrial areas into residential use. In some areas, I think you are giving the benefit to property developers. For example, waiving the exemption fee. Our purpose today is how we can carry out the revitalization of industrial buildings, and how we can make use of these space to build public housing. And the conclusion is very obvious. It's a no. And from paragraphs 2 to 5, it did not address one word the viability of the redevelopment. A lot of people think that these revitalization measures are a transfer of interests. It's not possible to convert these space into public housing, and we don't even have to read this paper. And this is not part of the long-term housing strategy. The most important thing is to find more land to build public housing. Just now, Christopher Chung said you are too slow. I think this is something the government has to look at. On the revitalization measures, even when we talk about transitional accommodation, it's not practicable. And from the building control perspective, town planning perspective, your existing revitalization measures are actually contradictive to these perspectives, to these considerations. So, Chairman, basically, I agree with the conclusion that transitional accommodation is not viable.
Well, it's rare. Mr. Wong Yuk-man has been complimenting you for 5 minutes. Next, Deputy Chairman, Mr. Paul Chia Wai-chun. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way I see it, the transitional use, of course, is only for the near term or for the short term. My conclusion is different than that of Mr. Wong Yuk-man. I'm actually disappointed. Of course, we have to consider the safety aspect. But we want to keep to the higher standard on natural lighting and ventilation. Yes, that's important too, because we would like where we live complies with all these requirements. But in the long run, there are some urgent issues that need to be resolved, like cage housing or the subdivided flats. In a cage house, you know, each bed space is just 15 feet. It's a cage, one on top of the other. There's no question of natural lighting or ventilation. And of course, these issues involve more than just one bureau. If you go by modern state standards, of course, you don't even need to do the study. You know that it's not going to work. Now, we've had caged housing policy before. Can we have some sort of a time frame? Because we've done it before, some form of interim rehousing. Of course, the conditions of interim housing would not be the best, but at least it will still be an improvement over where they are now. So personally, I hope the government, having considered safety, would relax certain criteria for the time being, because there's no point just dwelling on theory. If you talk about health, where they stay now is far worse off. I think government colleagues should know about that. So how can we make use of existing resources? That's the point. And revitalization of industrial buildings, certain policies are more long-term. Now, I worked in the government initially. We've been talking about transforming some industrial buildings into residential buildings because of an oversupply in industrial buildings, but we're still not doing anything. Why? Because there's a problem with the market. There are some industrial buildings zoned to residential use, but such buildings have not been redeveloped. Why? Because the owners look at the cost effectiveness and they don't think it's worth the effort. So would you consider it? Well, conversion may be possible, although Mr. Wang Yunman said there's transfer of interest or benefits. But because if they convert the use, they don't need to pay the additional premium. Mr. Lam is here. I think I remember reading some statistics. There's only one case of modification of lease. Maybe my figures are not accurate, but definitely there are just very few cases of conversion of industrial to residential use. But then for conversion from industrial to hotel or commercial uses, we see a lot more such cases. Now, our policy may affect the value of an industrial building. And for that reason, maybe owners are even more reluctant to pay the additional premium and do what you would hope they do. And it becomes a vicious circle. At the end, we're not able to meet the targets. So I think you have to consider how you can encourage redevelopment. Hotel, of course, is a form of, in some cases, the buildings are turned into hotels, but actually they could be turned into residential buildings. So I hope you would really give it some thought. Now I have a question for sites already turned redeveloped into hotels. Would there be a lease term to say that they cannot sell the hotel rooms separately? Perhaps I could first ask Mr. Lam to say something on land lease and additional premium. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Mr. Tse, under the revitalization of industrial building measures, how many industrial buildings have been converted in redeveloped into residential buildings? As at the end of June, there were 3 cases, and the documents have been signed for 2 of the cases. For 1 case, is still being processed. And in there's 1 other case where the applicant withdrew his application. Perhaps I could provide a bit more information. In the past 3 years, from 2012 to now, there were 5 cases of industrial buildings being redeveloped into residential buildings. That's the first point. The second point, or second question of Mr. Tse, is that for conversion into hotel use, and then is there any condition to say that they cannot sell the hotel room separately? Yes, there is such a condition. That is, say, there's wholesale conversion of industrial buildings to hotels, then the owners are not allowed to sell the hotel room separately. So there's such a condition. Mr. Chan, please. Anything to add? Well, if I may respond to some of the points of Mr. Tse. First, caged housing, subdivided flats, or petition rooms. Well, you might recall, members, there were safety problems with caged housing. That's why there was eventually a regulatory regime for caged housing. So safety is definitely to be borne in mind. Subdivided flats, there could be 2 types. That is, the flats are subdivided in a way that they're not in compliance with the buildings ordinance, and of course it can't be allowed. But if, say, the subdivision is done in accordance with the buildings ordinance, that means they meet our basic building safety requirements. in those cases, we would say those flats are safe because they've met the existing building ordinance requirements. Now, about changing the planned use of industrial buildings to other uses, if I could add, just now Mr. Wang Yaman also mentioned this point. For some industrial buildings, we have them rezoned the sites from industrial to residential or commercial or other uses. There were such isolated cases, actually. Now there are 5 sites, industrial building sites. They were previously government flatted factories, buildings. And now for these sites, they've been rezoned for public housing or HOS uses. Now, for wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use, maybe this is not suitable. But then we have allowed changing of land use so that industrial buildings could be redeveloped into housing, and in some cases into public housing or HOS, and we believe this will work and we'll continue to do it. Dr. Fernando Zhang. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This 4-page document on revitalization of industrial buildings, it all boils down to one thing: backing down. Now, when Leung Chun-ying was CE designate, he said he would consider converting industrial buildings into accommodation for singletons, and then he could shorten the waiting time for singleton unit families. And he even said it's estimated there could be 19,000 such units. But then it's all gone now. Now, after the measure is announced, Carrie Lam made it very clear that is in the broader scheme of revitalization measures for industrial buildings. She said the government had to find ways to remove obstacles in terms of buildings and planning requirements, and she thought it could be done. And then the issues such as hygiene, fire safety and so on could be addressed. And she said the legislative amendments could be done within 6 to 12 months. Now, she said so last September. Today, now 9 months later, this paper is a backtrack of what the government said before. There are many singletons on the waiting list. They could wait 5-7 years. They still do not get a unit. So there's a serious shortage. There are actually just 2 blocks of singleton units. One is Kwok Court in Sai Ying Pun. The other is the Heiwa House in Cheung Wan. They add up to less than 1,000 units, just a few hundred units. And there's a long waiting list. For Kwok Court, we know social workers referral cases, they're still just handling cases from February this year. For the low-income singletons or street sleepers, actually, they could be given help if there are more singleton units, but then we don't have such units. Originally, the chief executive, the chief secretary of administration, that is the upper echelon of the government, was said they could convert industrial buildings to provide singleton accommodation, but now no, it's all gone. So can I ask the Development Bureau what you have in mind now? Okay, this is not feasible. Are there other ways to deliver on the pledge made by the chief executive when he assumed office? That is to increase the number of singleton hostels and reduce waiting time for housing for singleton applicants. Mr. Chen, if I may respond to the overall housing supply issue. Now, it was already said that we wanted to address the waiting time for public housing. We need to increase land supply and housing supply. In terms of increasing housing supply, the government has adopted a multi-pronged approach to provide more land for both public housing and private housing. if we look at the revitalization measures for industrial buildings, in industrial sites, we encourage wholesale conversion of industrial buildings into other land uses. Actually, there are quite a number of industrial buildings, industrial sites, which have their land use changed to residential. Just now, the Land Department also gave us some information about cases of industrial sites being rezoned to residential uses, and such redevelopment has taken place. So we are trying to find more land for public and private housing development. And so here the consideration is, in terms of planning, how can we allow existing industrial sites to be rezoned to residential uses, and that would help our overall housing supply. Now, he hasn't answered my question, Mr. Chairman. Originally, the revitalization of industrial buildings could provide 19,000 units. You even gave a concrete figure. You said it could be done within 6 to 12 months, but now it's all gone. Mr. Chen, can you please focus in your reply to Dr. Fernando Jones' question? How come last September the government said something, now there's no follow-up? Can you be specific with your response, please? Mr. Chairman, last September, the Chief Secretary mentioned that within the framework of the revitalization of industrial buildings, we would study whether there's room for old industrial buildings to be converted into small-sized residential units for letting on an interim basis. This is to address the housing problem. But as we explained just now, under the building ordinance, there are safety requirements and requirements of natural lighting and ventilation, i.e. living conditions. And then there's also the town planning consideration. If we just allow wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for accommodation purpose, it may not be the most suitable means to increase housing supply. Okay, if you back down on this proposal, you need to come up with some new proposal. You can't just back down and leave it like that. Are you saying that what Carrie Lam said was all rubbish? Now, Mr. Chairman, what we're saying is that after the study, we concluded that wholesale conversion of existing industrial buildings into residential buildings may not be feasible. But in terms of planning, we could see how we could facilitate redevelopment of industrial buildings into residential buildings, and that would better help us to address the housing problem. So in the outline zoning, in the area assessment of industrial land, we always are on the lookout for sites that are suitable for rezoning from industrial to residential. In the last round of area assessment, some 30 hectares of industrial land would be rezoned for residential purposes. And in the coming round of area assessment, we will continue to see where there are suitable sites for rezoning to residential uses. Of course, redevelopment takes time. It's not that because we change the land use now, then a new building will spring up tomorrow. In addressing housing issues, if we want to provide suitable sites for increasing housing supply, changing the land use has to be the most thorough solution. Now, in the last round, 60 hectares, out of 60 hectares, 30 hectares were rezoned from industrial to residential uses. What about next round? When would you look at that? Mr. Chairman, for the new round of area assessments of industrial land in the territory, the area assessments, planning department has actually started the exercise. It's hoped that we could complete it by 2014. Now, we're trying to identify sites suitable for rezoning to residential. At the same time, we're looking at the taking a snapshot of the existing industrial buildings and industrial sites, and we will also do a medium to long-term projection on the industrial land demand. So we don't just look at residential uses in the area assessments. We also look at other uses, including business uses, commercial uses that I mentioned.
Kwok. Thank you, Chairman. I want to make a follow-up question. Just now, Mr. Chen said that residential use is only one of the possible uses for redeveloped buildings, and the government will look at the specific buildings, and the redevelopment is not just for residential use, and it also covers other uses, and it has to meet certain requirements such as fire safety, etc. When I look at the figures, 71 applications have been approved, covering 720,000 square meters of floor space. So my question is, has your objective been met, and what is your goal actually? Are you going to extend the redevelopment? You said the application, the submission deadline will be extended for 3 years, which is a good thing. When we talk about conversion, we often face constraints. Industrial buildings, after all, are quite different from residential units. If we change the land use of certain zones, you can carry it out through redevelopment. Would you approach owners and encourage them to redevelop their buildings? So can you please answer this question? Mr. Chen? Thank you, Chairman and Mr. Low. Our revitalization measures target older industrial buildings which are vacant. And our mission is to encourage them to redevelop or carry out wholesale conversion. I can give you a few more figures. 57 of the applications are for wholesale conversion, and 14 applications are for redevelopment. We noticed that for old industrial buildings which are rezoned into commercial use, and for buildings which meet the minimum age, which is 10 years or more, and we have around 200 industrial buildings which meet such requirements, such conditions. And most of the applications we received are from industrial buildings located in commercial areas which are wholly owned. And therefore, we do see incentives for owners of such industrial buildings. And on communicating with the respective owners, the Lands Department actually has a specific work group to deal with applications for industrial building revitalization. And any interested owners are welcome to contact the Lands Department. And the LD will provide relevant information on industrial building revitalization to facilitate the process. So maybe Mr. Lam can add more on this. as Mr. Chen just said, the Lands Department established a work group to deal with applications from industrial buildings. And we also issued a set of guidelines for industry personnel to file their applications. And as the Deputy Secretary said, anyone who has questions are welcome to contact the Lands Department for support. Kwok-hing. Chairman, in order to find land, the government is actually helping property developers, and they are turning entire buildings into luxury homes. If you look at Chunwan, we have a few buildings like that. You can see residential buildings surrounded by industrial buildings, and they are selling for several $1,000s per square feet. And you can see this is very unsuitable for residential use. You're actually benefiting big developers like Kwok-hing, and Hong Kong does not have very clear housing policies. A lot of commercial activities are actually taking place in industrial buildings, and we're not just talking about creative industries. A lot of businesses cannot afford commercial spaces, and they are and industrial buildings are their last resort. And now the government is driving away these merchants, these SMEs. You are killing their only chance of survival. Rents are going up. The best example is East Kowloon. A lot of space are turned into grade 8 office spaces. And in Fotan, a lot of creative professionals are being driven out, and it's not possible to sustain long-term development. And redeveloped industrial buildings are not actually that profitable. And the government is not helping people who are living in subdivided units. So the question is, does the administration have any policy in place to help these people without the help of the property developers? For industrial buildings, apart from owners who are waiting for compulsory sales, a lot of industrial buildings do not have very high vacancy rates. A lot of businesses are being driven out of business. Thank you, Chairman. On Mr. Kwok's question, if I understand correctly, the first question is, does the government have any policy in place to take care of redevelopment by themselves? Do you have any policy to help people who are homeless and or people who are living in very dangerous conditions? To solve the housing issue, the most fundamental solution is to increase the amounts of public housing. And as I said, for industrial zones, our goal is to rezone lands which are suitable for domestic use into residential spaces. For older industrial buildings, after assessment, if they are found to be suitable for residential use, they can be redeveloped into public housing. And the goal is to increase housing supply. The idea of transitional accommodation might not be a long-term solution. How do you did you assess the vacancy rates of industrial buildings? I don't have such figures on hand. I can ask the buildings department to add more later. On subdivided flats in industrial buildings, our policy is to enforce the law according to specific situations. We have made specific inspections at over 200 buildings, and we carried out and we enforced the law on certain illegal structures. And we will enforce the law when if we detect illegal subdivided units in such buildings. So what Mr. Kwok said, his question was whether the government has any plans to convert these buildings into transitional accommodation. Would the government do anything? I think our answer is very clear. In terms of building safety and tenant safety, we think that transitional accommodation is not an ideal solution to increasing housing supply. And a better and more thorough solution is to rezone industrial areas into residential use. The government said they would revitalize industrial buildings. I understand other members' questions. If you want to redevelop industrial buildings to build more subdivided flats, I agree that this is not suitable. As the paper has addressed, these spaces, the environment is simply not suitable for subdivided flats. If you have paid so much efforts to rebuild, to redevelop these buildings, it's not sensible. I think rezoning the land altogether is a more viable solution. Redeveloping these industrial buildings would not be effective. I think we have to find more space to build to increase housing supply. From a realistic consideration, we should pay attention to really redevelop these older industrial buildings. And the key in this problem is the land premium. If you relax or waive the land premiums, I'm sure a lot of members here, like Fernando Cheung or Kwok-hing, would say you are corrugating with developers. would you consider mixed-use developments as in the past? If you allow them to redevelop the buildings, would you specify certain floor areas for redevelopment? I think this is something we can do to avoid the conflicts of transfer of interests.
Mr. Chen, on redevelopment of industrial buildings, actually I thank Mr. Yip for his question. It was not exactly answered an early point made by Mr. Kwok. The conversion or redevelopment of industrial building would benefit only owners of buildings. But of course now, if there's any redevelopment, we'll ask for the payment of full premium. For industrial buildings, the plot ratio is usually high. So in a case of redevelopment, the major incentive is that after the change of land use, the land use or the gross floor area would be worth more. But on the plan, actually, we won't see much room for further increase in area because usually industrial buildings would have been built to the full plot ratio. Hybrid development, yes, it was suggested in the past. We have to give it very careful consideration. But let's say for now, already industrial buildings are built up to the plot ratio of 15, and then you want to propose a hybrid development. That means they have to give up some of the floor space, and they end up having less floor space than before. Then there won't be so much incentive on the part of owners. But of course, there won't be redevelopment if there are no incentives. So even with the incentive, they may still think that, oh, they're not going to lose on a project, at least they'll earn a little profit. And then you ask them to surrender some units or floor space for use by the housing department and so on. I think you really should consider this possibility. Otherwise, it's all lip service when we talk about industrial buildings addressing our housing needs. Mr. Chen, well, I will take the views back for consideration. Mr. Lee Chak-yan, so you're just coming here to tell us that the revitalization for industrial building would not address the housing issue. Is that what you're saying? You're just saying that now you won't use industrial buildings for transitional accommodation. But the fact is a lot of people are staying in the subdivided flats in industrial buildings, and then we don't even know if the community care fund would pay the rent for them. Of course, we have put forward this view to the community care fund, is that these people ought to be given rent assistance as well. But if you do not relax the requirements on industrial buildings so they could be converted into transitional accommodation, you do not have any other short-term measures to address the living condition of subdivided flats in industrial buildings, because tenants there still have a long waiting time for public housing, and if you do not try to improve their living condition now, there's no other way out for these occupants. It seems that you have now said that we're not going to consider revitalizing industrial buildings for transitional accommodation. If that's the case, how do you address the housing problem, and how do you address the housing needs of those already living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings? Mr. Chen, thank Mr. Lee for your question. I think your question covers a much broader scope than the scope of the paper today. You're talking about dealing with subdivided flats as a whole. For subdivided flats in industrial buildings, well, actually, I'll ask the buildings department colleagues to say something later. Now, for residential uses in industrial buildings, we believe it is not appropriate, because the fact is there would be safety issues involved. And as we pointed out in the study on transitional accommodation, now can we not relax the requirements so that there could be transitional accommodation in industrial buildings? But we cannot actually meet the major requirements for safety and other protection for tenants. So we find that the approach of wholesale conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation may not be the best way to address the housing needs. Now, in terms of the overall housing supply, we would like to increase the supply of public housing units. And for that to be achieved, we need to increase land supply. Well, actually, in this meeting, we have explained many of our multi-pronged measures already. So we need to turn some of the industrial sites into residential sites. And some of these sites may eventually be used for public housing or HOS units. So that's why we believe this is a better approach. Perhaps I could invite Mr. Yu to say something about law enforcement. Now, for subdivided flats in industrial buildings, for domestic use, there is the question of safety. In industrial buildings, if some parts of the buildings are still being used for industrial purpose, definitely there would be a safety and a fire hazard aspect. Now, subdividing industrial building units into domestic flats, in 2012, the Building Department has extended the scope of our major operations to cover industrial buildings. We would like to step up law enforcement of non-compliance with the buildings ordinance in industrial buildings. We've actually started such operations. And in line with the Building Department, we will issue notice for terminating the use of the unit for residential purpose. We would also issue orders for the removal of the unauthorized building works. For tenants affected by such enforcement actions, the government provides various forms of assistances, including financial assistance. And relevant departments may help to identify suitable location for these tenants. And the Social Work Department also has a team of social workers to give support to such projects of forced eviction of tenants in factory buildings. Well, despite your answer, you haven't really addressed this question. That is, we don't have enough housing supply. Now, people on the waiting list may have to wait 5-10 years, especially for the singletons. The waiting time is almost indefinite. Now, you mentioned safety issues. We're not saying that you should disregard safety. We're saying whether you could come up with a solution to safety issues, and then you could put in place certain measures and allow transitional uses of these industrial buildings. Is it the case that it's definitely not feasible, or could you still explore it further? Thank you, Mr. Lee. On the policy of transitional accommodation in industrial buildings, we've given it very careful thought. Let's say there is an industrial building block. Let's say there's wholesale conversion to transitional accommodation. Let's assume we set aside the natural lighting and ventilation requirements, and conversion is done. Still, we cannot address the issue of what the next door building is being used for. Now, what we see often is that in the next building, perhaps there's still storage of dangerous goods, or there's still active industrial operations in the building next door. If the building is right adjacent to the industrial building under question, there's no way we could find a solution to the safety problems. So for these cases, if we allow transitional accommodation as a policy, it may not be possible given the safety considerations. But we believe the more long-term solution would be in terms of planning. That is, say for the whole area, if it's suitable for rezoning into commercial or business use, it could be done so, or it could be rezoned into residential use if it's suitable. Now, we haven't been doing area assessments for too long, but we've seen such cases. Let's say if an industrial building site is rezoned to residential, then there are cases actually of such buildings being redeveloped into residential buildings. Now, of course, a member mentioned that maybe some developers have taken advantage of that and turned industrial buildings into luxury residential buildings. But I think the ultimate solution to housing supply is land supply, or change of land use. Mr. Leung Chi-chung. Now, there's been aspiration for industrial buildings to be converted into transitional accommodation, but here we're told the feasibility is almost nil. In that case, does it mean the government won't consider it? Of course, we know the revitalization of industrial buildings was not first proposed by the Siwalan government. It was first proposed by Donald Tsang's government. By revitalization means that for dead industrial buildings, they could be revitalized and their potential or value could be unleashed. But then some would then complain there's collusion between the government and the businesses, and there's a transfer of benefits. From your paper, it seems that quite a number of owners of industrial buildings have revitalized their buildings. Some managed to do so, some did not. Now, revitalization into commercial use is possible. Revitalization into residential use, we're told is not possible for one reason alone, that's safety. It's not safe to do so. But then it's not possible that there aren't solutions, because it's up to us to say what is safe. It's up to us to do the design to make it safe. It's not possible that it cannot be done. Of course, there are 2 blocks being dealt with that way, but of course, perhaps in terms of cost, it could be high. Now, in the new territories, we be able to identify a lot of land sites for residential development. But in the urban areas, industrial buildings represent good source of land supply. Now, we no longer have any industry in Hong Kong, so if you keep the industrial buildings, either they're used for commercial purposes or other purposes. So there's a change in the value of the building as a result. If you change the building into residential, it's also changed the value. Of course, it's a matter of whether you give the housing to the poor or the rich. For transitional accommodation, the purpose is that for those with urgent needs or those with little means, they'll get accommodation. So how come the government won't consider it? Why do you try to dwell on the technical obstacles? What about some industrial buildings being resumed by government and then the government could redevelop it? Or maybe in some cases you could just improve upon the safety aspects and then you would have instant transitional accommodation. Why can't you not do it? Now there are now several hundreds of industrial building blocks. Have you tried to group them into which are definitely not feasible and which are more feasible, for instance? Mr. Chen, we said that for revitalization of industrial buildings, it may not be suitable to turn existing industrial buildings in a wholesale manner into transitional accommodation. We've explained why in terms of safety and feasibility there are a lot of constraints. On revitalization of industrial buildings, can we redevelop some of the industrial buildings into residential buildings? Well, that can be done. The Lands Department mentioned there were 3 such cases. Of course, in one of the cases, the owner withdrew the application eventually, but under the current revitalization measures of industrial buildings, there are applications to redevelop buildings into residential buildings. Of course, for the redevelopment, they may meet the Buildings Department and the Lands Department's requirements, and then the site is suitable for such rezoning. because if we believe a site could be zoned, our site is already zoned residential, that means because we have already done a study and believe that site is suitable for residential, that's why we have so zoned it. And so for redevelopment of industrial buildings into residential buildings, that will still help the housing supply. Now, second question, if the government will resume industrial buildings for redevelopment. Last year, the Urban Renewal Authority proposed 2 pilot projects. They would like to resume old industrial buildings. For one block is to be converted to office use, the other is to be rezoned into residential use. But for technical reasons, the Development Bureau has suspended the resumption project. But we're still actively considering whether old industrial buildings could be resumed for redevelopment into residential buildings. We will continue with this study.
Alice Mack. Chairman, I think the government's paper is impartial and pragmatic, and it has done a good job of analyzing the situation. And the conclusion of redeveloping older industrial buildings for transitional accommodation is not possible. For tenants living in, for residents living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings, they face a lot of challenges and difficulties. We are concerned how we can help these residents living in subdivided flats. If transitional accommodation is not possible, do you have other solutions? I know this meeting is on long-term housing strategy. However, since you are here, I would ask you this question. What would you do to help residents living in subdivided flats in industrial areas? If you change the land use of industrial buildings into residential use, do you actually carry it out on a proactive basis, or what kind of conditions must be met before you carry out the efforts? Thank you, Chairman. Maybe I'll answer the second question first. Rezoning industrial land actually every few years the planning department would carry out the area assessments of industrial land, and the latest assessments have been carried out, and by 2014 we will know which land lots we would be rezoned from industrial use into other uses. And in the assessments in 2009, some 60 hectares of land had been proposed for zoning. Last time we had 16 land lots for industrial use, and rezoning works have been completed, and for the remaining land lots we would carry out the rezoning works part by part. On the issue of subdivided flats, as far as I know, the key is to resolve the safety issue of such flats, so that they comply with the building's ordinance in terms of safety requirements, fire safety, etc. And the point is not all subdivided flats are illegal. Some of them are actually legal. However, for subdivided flats located in industrial buildings, and this is they are certainly illegal. Just now, we mentioned that our annual inspections would include industrial buildings. If subdivided flats still exist in industrial buildings, its tenants still face dangers. And the fundamental approach is to increase the supply of public housing. You did not answer Alice Mack's and other members' questions. For tenants living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings, what would you do to settle them or relocate them? Can anyone answer this question? Chairman, just now the Buildings Department said it's a law enforcement issue. If we identify subdivided flats during our inspections, we have measures in place to help them. So maybe the Buildings Department can elaborate more. Mr. Yu, please. Thank you, Chairman. When we carry out law enforcement, the government has measures in place to help affected tenants in terms of financial considerations, in terms of helping them identify suitable housing. And the Buildings Department can also provide social services and emotional support for these tenants. If the problem can be solved so easily, we don't need a discussion here today. I think you're not answering the question. Mr. Poche, I have a quick question first. When did the government start studying the feasibility of transitional accommodation? We started studying transitional accommodation since September last year. In other words, in the policy address announced on 30th of August, or the CS's announcements on the 7th of September, were these not considered by your department or bureau? Thank you, Mr. Chair's question. When we raised the idea of transitional accommodation, we were talking about the conversion of existing industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. We simply raised the possibility of such proposal. And in our review of existing measures to facilitate the conversion, and under this review, one of the issues was the conversion of industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. On the 7th of September last year, the CS mentioned the redevelopment of industrial buildings. At that time, did you not receive any information or instructions at that time? After extensive studies, we have done a lot of assessments in terms of building control, town planning, land lease. We carried out comprehensive assessments before we come up with a conclusion. If we want to convert industrial buildings for transitional accommodation under revitalization measures to solve medium to long-term housing needs, under the existing revitalization framework, this was one of our measures. This was one of our ideas. I'm not trying to make life difficult for you, but I just want to know for an important policy like this, were you consulted on this? So what you're saying is that what you're saying is that the CS and the CE were talking rubbish. Compared with cage housing, subdivided flats are in very bad living conditions. Rezoning such industrial areas is obviously the best solution. However, how do we solve the imminent problem of housing? You talked about housing, of course, housing safety. Of course, safety is very important. But how do you solve the problem? We do not expect subdivided flats to be legalized immediately. Can we decivilize this issue? Decriminalize rather this issue? Can you go the extra mile to implement this? You talk about wholesale conversion of industrial buildings. Can you redevelop certain units into residential use on a transitional basis? On cage housing and subdivided flats, we do not agree. We care about safety. If any subdivided flats or cage housing have safety concerns, we have to do something. For subdivided flats, we will carry out inspections, and we would enforce the law. For cage housing, if any units have safety concerns, we would carry out demolishment. And on redeveloping industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use, at the end of the day, we have to consider the safety of the residents, and this is not something we can compromise. After balancing different factors, we understand the need for transitional accommodation. However, we have to understand why under the building ordinance we have all these requirements for natural lighting, ventilation, etc. At this point, I do not see compromising safety requirements in return for temporary housing solutions. Actually, Mr. Chair's question is for residents currently living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings. They cannot afford private housing. Their safety concern is that they don't have anywhere to live in. It's not that they don't have natural lighting or ventilation. So under this situation, can you make flexible or rather more human accommodations to provide them a temporary place to stay until the government can provide more public housing. Today is the final meeting. Can you discuss this issue with the CS and CE? In September last year, the CS, because of what the CS said in September and what the CE said last year, we have an expectation on the strategy. Thank you, Chairman. Can the Deputy Secretary discuss this problem, this issue? You do not understand people who are struggling to have a place to live in, and you are talking about natural lighting and ventilation. This is absurd. The problem is people don't even have a place to stay. Chairman, on your question, I want to emphasize one point. It's not just about natural lighting and ventilation. It's about safety. For residents currently living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings, our view is that it's unacceptable for us to think that they are safe. We have considered the possibility of converting some industrial buildings for transitional accommodation use. If such buildings if such buildings are to satisfy all the safety requirements, it's not impossible. However, a lot of modifications have to be done in order to meet all the safety requirements. And that's why our view is that if we want to solve housing, this housing issue, we have to rezone the industrial zones into residential zones, and converting industrial buildings for transitional accommodation is not an answer. For people, existing residents living in subdivided flats in industrial buildings, and safety is most important. Frederick Fong, Mr. Leung Kwok-hing, you have a chance to speak. Frederick Fong and then Leung Kwok-hing. Chairman, Mr. Chen said a lot of these buildings are not safe.
Now, cage housing could be turned from unsafe to safe. In the paper, you didn't tell us how many steps we need to take to render accommodation in industrial buildings safe. Now, you can't convince me. You will consider the safety and angle, and then you say it's to do with natural lighting and ventilation. You say it's on safety and health grounds, but then you say that as long as you have money, you can convert the buildings, but if the cost is so much, it might be easier to tear down the whole building and redevelop it. So you didn't tell us anything about that. If the conversion is as expensive as redevelopment, of course, it's better to go for redevelopment. But the thing is that for these industrial buildings, some are being used for industrial purposes, some not. If you want to resume the entire building and then demolish it, it may take too long. Maybe there are already 1/3 of the units vacant in the industrial building, and we could make use of those 1/3 of the units at once. But you can't tell us what the difficulties are. All the reasons you give are not really reasons. Paragraph 8, traffic conditions, surrounding environment, noise impact in an industrial buildings. Maybe there are just a thousand or so workers. And What about a lot of people crowding into a unit to say? So you made 30 years ago, we had vibrant garment industry. So were there more workers working in the industrial buildings then, or are there more people staying and living in the industrial buildings now? Definitely there would be more workers. And then you said there was no safety problem, and workers had to go up and down these buildings to work, and there would be no traffic problems or noise impact. Now you're just putting, say, 20, 30 households in industrial buildings. How come it would present such a big problem? It's about how long we will use these units, not forever. We're not saying forever. CY Leung said from 10,000 to 60,000 units, it will only happen on the 5th year when he's to step down. It will be the 6th year, actually, after his term. So in the 6th year, even if he can produce 30,000 units, that would not be enough. I think we need 30,000 public housing units. So 20,000, 25,000, 30,000, it will take us about 10 years to reach that target, which is the new target. And as you have more public housing units, of course, then you could reduce the number of transitional accommodation units in industrial buildings. If you could regulate caged housing, how can you not regulate transitional accommodation in industrial buildings? You can't explain it, and you just say it can't be done. So how can you convince people? So what's your question, really? I'm saying I'm not at all convinced. How do you convince me? Mr. Chen, can you please explain and answer Mr. Feng's questions? Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Feng, for your comments and questions. Paragraph 7, we've tried to explain why, under the Buildings Ordinance, wholesale conversion of industrial buildings into transitional accommodation may not work. First, there's a technical consideration. There's for existing industrial buildings, if they are to be converted to residential buildings. Well, there are certain requirements under the Buildings Ordinance for residential buildings, and these requirements are very different than those for industrial buildings. So in terms of safety and health grounds consideration, this may not be a feasible approach. We've actually talked to some industrial building owners as well. Now, to meet the residential requirement, many industrial buildings, in particular the older industrial buildings with enclosed design, for these buildings, they would have to remove a good part of the facade before these buildings could be converted into residential use. That means there's a reduction of floor space, so the project may not be financially viable. And also, the conversion itself would be very costly. So that's why, technically and financially, the conversion may not be feasible. Even if we launch such a policy, it may still not work. And instead, we believe in terms of planning, we could there's room for redevelopment of the entire building and change the land use. Then in terms of meeting the Buildings Ordinance and the planning requirements, then we could come up with some buildings that meet the housing need. There are 3 members left, 5 minutes each, please, because I can't really extend the meeting. There's another meeting following this one. Mr. Leung Kwok-hing, Mr. Kwok Wai-kang, and Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Mr. Leung Kwok-hing. I don't need any reply, Mr. Chairman. In this paper, you're announcing that C.Y. Leung and Carrie Lam speak rubbish. You're being very brave. I think you will be promoted. You're saying that maybe you're saying that you have told them, but then they just came up and speak nonsense. But maybe now you revisit the issue, or they revisit the issue, they think it can't work. So actually you should be sacked, right? You deceived your superiors. And then C.Y. Leung then deceived us. And then C.Y. Leung then came back to you. Why did you want to fight him? Because Harry Jam made it very clear. She even said how it would be done. The legislation will be amended within 6 to 12 months. But it's 9 months now, and then the project is aborted. So why did you want to fight them? I know what you're going to say. Compromise safety or sacrifice safety? It's not about compromise, it's about sacrifice, right? So you say you cannot sacrifice safety, or what you say in the paper, compromise. We know that from the beginning. How come you didn't know from the beginning? You shouldn't have known. That's really the key point. You don't have to answer me. Don't bother. If it's just about safety, and that's the only issue, even the blind could see that issue. And only now, today, you told us you found out eventually you could not sacrifice safety. But what if you had overlooked it and people could be killed, right? I think it's all nonsense. All the factors have been listed out here. You say it's not. You say that you could only do it on bulk. They say 60 hectares of land. 30 hectares became commercial sites, another 30 hectares in residential sites. So what do you want to do? Do you want more residential land? Of course, going by your plan, there'll be more commercial land rather than residential land, because it's tough to put residential buildings there, given the surrounding environment. You're still trying to put the blame on us. You say that, of course, with the approval of LESCO, the buildings ordinance could be amended, but that will still harm the health and safety of tenants. So you say that we won't come and beg you. You want us to come up with an amendment legislation? Forget it. Do you remember what you said in paragraph 7? Yeah, you could anticipate what we're going to say. That is, we're going to say today, please do something. You said you're going to provide 19,000 units. Please come up with these units. Please amend the legislation. We have professionals here, right? So you have closed off that route, and you're not doing anything. So what do? I've asked you many times. Of course, you're not from the Transport and Housing Bureau. Shancock Estate, North Point Estate, Wong Chuk Kan Estate, all these major estates, they were public housing before, is no longer. And you say industrial sites could be rezoned into residential sites. Madam Chen Yuhan and I had to fight for those industrial buildings in Shanpo Kong. What were those sites? What are those sites? Are they for public housing now? No. If there's dereliction of duty on your part, you should resign, right? If you say it's not dereliction of duty on your part, then it's those other two. They must have been talking gibberish. So I still have to ask a quick question. So if it's not you who have committed dereliction of duty, is it them then? Mr. Chen? Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Leung, for your comments. In terms of land supply and housing issue, no, forget it. 1 year ago, before Carol Lam said that in August, before C.Y. Leung said that, did you ever tell them that they must not sacrifice the safety of tenants? So I'm telling you, did you ever tell them what they're going to say would be rubbish? Did you ever say that to them? Did you ever give them this piece of advice that they mustn't do it, otherwise they could be held accountable? If you have not, then it's your fault. Mr. Kwok-hing, on revitalization of industrial buildings. Originally, the community's view is that we won't waste land resources, and we would like to help local arts groups to thrive. But with the current revitalization measures for industrial buildings, sites are now turned into hotels, commercial uses that flew in the face of the original intention of the proposal. It was actually suggested by the community. Now, could we add certain conditions? Maybe in a wet market, we say there must be so many wet stores and so many dry goods stores. Perhaps in revitalization of industrial buildings, it would set conditions as well. So some units should be used by local arts groups. So you set a percentage. If it's a free market, that means you just leave it to them. They could turn all the buildings into hotels or commercial buildings. At the end, it's only the real estate developers who benefit, but that's a reality. For transitional accommodation, the Deputy Secretary made it sound so serious. We must not sacrifice the safety of tenants. There must be no compromise. So you have actually ruled out the idea of conversion of industrial buildings into transitional accommodation. But the fact is there are already people living there. You say that it's so serious, it's not safe, it's not hygienic, people there are fire hazards, then why don't you enforce law? Why don't you drive everybody out? That's the first point. If you put it the other way, if you don't drive people out, it's because you want this to be a transitional accommodation, right? That's why you're not evicting all these tenants. You're not doing anything, so it's obvious. Now you're being wishy-washy. You say you're not doing anything, but you're actually doing something. Since you're doing something, the tenants, the occupants are saying that you should impose more regulation on owners so that they could make good the facilities. Because just last month, some deputation came to lodge a complaint. They live in subdivided flats in industrial buildings. They have no money, so where they stay, there's no ventilation. Definitely it's not going to be well lit naturally. And then there are hygienic problems. There are many units. They have to share the same toilet, and there's little space. The problem was put on the table, but you let go of the owner. He could still collect his rent, and you not impose any regulation. So if you say that you won't accept transitional accommodation, then build your own transitional accommodation. You are the development bureau or the housing department comes up with some idea to build transitional accommodation. Yeah, you won't allow people to provide transitional accommodation, but you won't do anything yourself. So what do you expect? Yes, it's true, it's not safe, but there are people living there in those unsafe conditions. How do you address that?
On the second question of subdivided flats in industrial buildings, I've explained earlier. If these buildings are located near other industrial buildings, there are certain dangers, and the buildings department must carry out stern law enforcement for such subdivided flats in industrial buildings. And we must not tolerate these conditions. And this is different from subdivided flats located in residential buildings, because in residential buildings, these subdivided flats might be able to meet building requirements, and this is a difference. And the other question about art groups. Right now, our revitalization policy covers industrial buildings under private ownership. To a large extent, this is a commercial decision, and our policy is not intended to help art groups specifically. However, we would not rule out this possibility for specific cases. For example, specific owners of industrial buildings in Kowloon East. Wu Chi-wai. For this paper, if you decide to cancel this these revitalization measures, I would welcome the decision. A lot of art groups are operating in industrial buildings. Some owners would build subdivided units in such buildings. The problem is once the revitalization measures were launched, you are changing the landscape of the industrial zones. Everyone was expecting these revitalization measures to give them benefits, and the one immediate effect is that the rents of these for these art groups have gone up. And converting industrial buildings for residential use is not appropriate, as we have learned from past experience. And the government has enforced the law. And the government policy is very ambiguous. Ambiguous because it says certain subdivided flats in residential buildings are legal. So this is very unclear. So I think this is it is a good thing to cancel these revitalization measures for industrial buildings. When the CS made her announcements on revitalizing the industrial buildings, she had not thought it out carefully, and she did not expect it to be viable. If the industrial building owners decide to make alterations to satisfy the government's needs, a lot of costs are involved, and as a result, a lot of them have decided against doing so. And personally, I am in favor of canceling these revitalization policies. And this would allow industrial buildings to reverse to their old existing conditions, and I think this would soothe the pressures of the shoulders of many art groups. I think the government should step up its law enforcement on industrial buildings. The government has to be stricter on illegal structures in industrial buildings. If you tighten up the measures, the industrial buildings can regulate themselves. Thank you, Chairman. On the illegal uses of industrial buildings, such as subdivided flats, or uses that may cause danger, we have a very clear stance. We would certainly carry out the law. On the revitalization measures for industrial buildings, the scope is very wide. We encourage the redevelopment and wholesale conversion of older industrial buildings into different uses, including residential use. In today's discussion, I want to use this opportunity to clarify one thing. On the current shortage of housing, the government will consider different options. Last year, we raised the idea of transitional accommodation. However, to actually implement this idea, we carried out a comprehensive study, and after the study, after balancing different interests, although we see a potential use of such transitional accommodation, however, on the other hand, we could not guarantee the safety of the tenants. and that's why we do not find transitional accommodation a viable option. Time's up. This meeting is the final meeting, and we do not have other items on the agenda. Just hold on, please. Upon the approval of members, when the government announces the results of its assessment studies next year, a public hearing will be held to invite public opinion on the government's papers. And the electoral panel on housing will submit a report. I see Mr. Paul Chair raised his hand. I want to declare my interests. I am a member of a